This 1945 John Deere A doesn't have an electric starter. To get it running, you set the choke and then open the petcocks to relieve cylinder pressure so you can swing the flywheel. George Fischer was 10 years old when this shiny new machine chuffed into the Fischer farmyard, so he knows this routine very well. Both cylinders firing smoothly, George is ready to partner the old A with his vintage 1930s Twin City threshing machine. All three are in remarkably good shape for their years, ready to take on a load of oat sheaves that were cut and bundled for the occasion. A special occasion in this case because it is the last of George and Dolores' annual threshing demonstrations. When they retired from farming 22 years ago, they launched the annual event as a way of giving their children, and extended local farming families and friends, a chance to experience a taste of the threshing bees of days gone by. Because nothing like this exists on farms around here anymore, and when today is over, it will be another final glimpse of a bygone era, perhaps the last tangible link to much of the history of our local farming families. Most of the people gathered here today are descended from homesteaders who began breaking bush and sod almost 120 years ago. There was no railroad to this part of Saskatchewan in 1906, when my European great-grandparents Ferdinand and Katerina Lang drove their covered wagon up the Prince Albert Trail. Their first stop was on the site of what would become the Fischer farm, where their son John Lang Sr. had already claimed his quarter section. His neighbors on the adjoining quarter to the north were John and Rose Holterman, whose daughter Augusta would later marry Charles Fischer, George's father, who took over both the Holterman and Lang quarters when John Lang and John Holterman left farming to start a lumber and construction business in nearby Quinton. This house is one of many they built, and it's one of the last farmhouses of that era that is still in use today by descendants of these families. A mile or so west of Fischer's, my grandparents Max and Teresa Lang's house is still standing, unused since their youngest son Fern lived and farmed here in the 50s. A half-mile away, my uncle Gabe Lang, ironically no relation to our family, and his wife Zita Lang, my dad's sister, lived in this house and farmed several quarters here. Dad was known as Johnny Max Lang to differentiate him from too many other local John Langs. He married yet another Lang, my mother, Anne, who grew up on her parents Agatha and Franz Lang's farm 2 miles north of Fischer's. Mom and Dad ended up farming a mile to the east. These perhaps confusing details serve to reveal an invisible but complex and interconnected history that is woven through the gathering today. The descendants of Langs, Fischers, Holtermans, and Degelmans, among others, are here today to reconnect with their parents and ancestors. The humble threshing machine is serving as a symbol of all that went before. For some of us, watching it at work is like stepping into a time machine, the sounds, smells, and sights taking us back to the days when this was an annual event on all our farms. For younger relatives, it's a new experience of olden days farming, and these youngsters may need to know how this rattling old machine works. Running off the tractor's pulley, a long drive belt turns its partner master pulley on the separator, which drives all the machinery. Sheaves, or bundles, are dropped onto a conveyor belt that feeds them into a set of rotating knives that cut the twine that binds them. The mix of straw and grain continue into the machine, where a rotating cylinder separates grain from straw and passes it onto the rattle chain that bumps it up and onto a series of shakers and screens. The grain falls through to the bottom, where an elevator carries it up to a spout and into a waiting truck or bin. The straw and chaff are tossed to the end, where a high-speed fan blows them out and onto a pile of straw or into a barn loft. Although it looks archaic today, The threshing machine was a huge improvement over manual flailing, just as bindering was to cutting grain with a scythe. When bindering was done with horses, it was a one-man operation, but a switch to tractors required one person driving the tractor and the other riding the binder behind it. The binder cuts the grain onto a conveyor belt where it's fed into a packer that compresses it into bundles, ties each with twine, and then spits them out onto a carrier. After a few bundles, the operator trips the carrier, which deposits them onto the stubble. Their more workers, family volunteers in this case, form them into stooks. In the early pre-railroad days, custom threshing machines and crews were few and far between. As the crews moved from farm to farm with their huge steam tractors, settlers would have to wait their turn. But when the Grand Trunk Railroad made its way to what became the towns of Quinton and Raymore in 1908, farm equipment was readily available and more farmers bought their own threshing machines. And when they had finished their own crops, they would take on neighboring farms. Here my father, Johnny Max Lang, is pitching bundles in the 1930s at a threshing operation run by his uncle Bill Lang and his trusty old Rumley oil pull tractor. By the 1960s, combines had mostly replaced threshing machines, so in 1962, my brother-in-law, Tony Schneider, decided to film a day of threshing at our farm, as a way to remember the old days. At this time, Dad had been contracting the threshing job to his neighbor and good friend Charlie Fischer, who set up the Twin City next to our barn. 60 years ago to the month of George's last threshing demonstration, he is seen here firing up the very same John Deere A, ready for a day of threshing oats. Out in the field, my cousins Mervyn and Lionel, as well as a local hired hand, are pitching bundles into the hay rack while Dad drives the tractor. Here, my brother Ed drives a load up to the threshing machine, followed by Lionel. Dad keeps an eye on the loft, ensuring the straw pile is filling the spaces, while I, partially visible, work in the granary, spreading the oats into the corners. Dad and Charlie conferred during a lunch break, possibly talking politics. There were 2 such lunch breaks during the day. Threshing required plenty of calories, although they don't seem to show much on this crew as we take a bow at the end of the day. Not many of us are still around 62 years later. George, of course, remains the straw boss. Today his brother Edward is on tractor duty, and my brother Ed is watching carefully, commenting about the memories this evokes. Ed and many of the people here have had ample opportunities to join George's annual event over the past 22 years. When Saskatchewan celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2005, we were there to cheer on Quinton's celebratory parade. Here, the Hartle family with Albert, Mary, Larry, and other relatives. Here's Henry Holterman, son of John Holterman, and his wife Josephine Holterman, née Brockman, riding by. Lining the parade route, we see Langs, Fischers, and even Quinton's own Petro girls, our cousins who flew in from far-flung Hamilton, Ontario. Their father, Joe, had been the town's blacksmith for many years. And here comes George, his John Deere and the Twin City en route to the sports grounds for the demonstration. There, old friends and neighbors watch, and many get into the action.
You got a license to run this thing? I'm taking a chance, but I don't know. You got that little good, Hey, it's been a while.
And so, for 22 years, George took these demonstrations from town to town. Here in 2008, he runs one for Raymore's 100th anniversary. For me, these final days mark the end of a decades-long goodbye. Over the 50-plus years since Larry Hartle started farming our land, which was originally homesteaded by his great-grandfather 100 years ago, he left much of our farmyard as it was, with nature slowly taking it back, until he regretfully cleared the field for cultivation. Our family is grateful to him for keeping the memories alive as long as he did. In the 1950s, Dad commissioned Ernie Luthi, a renowned prairie painter, to do a portrait of our farm. His artist's imagination was prescient, it seems, as he imagined the stooped fields on acres where we maintained only pasture. 60 years later, the entire farmyard has recently been cropped. Time changes everything. The modernization of farming was likely inevitable, and certainly today's farmers are exponentially more productive than our ancestors. Where horses once pulled small implements and 160 acres was an average farm, today 500 horsepower tractors and massive combines allow one person to do the work of dozens. Where it once took days to binder, stook, and thresh 40 acres of oats, these combines crop hundreds of acres in one day in one operation, on farms of 10,000 acres or more. As always, old people like me reminisce about the past while youth look to the future. And, as always, that's how it should be. For us, it's the end of an era. For them, it's just the beginning.